Hello and welcome. When does a government go too far, and is anyone ever held accountable? When it comes to the so-called war on terror, the rules were effectively thrown out of the window on the grounds of protecting national security, although many might argue that the world is hardly a safer place. Civilians became exposed to harsh practices such as rendition, where people were basically kidnapped by the government and sent to secret prisons, usually to be tortured. There's been the interception of phone and email communications without court orders, and in the case of Guantanamo Bay prison, people being kept in jail for years without access to lawyers or courts. Now a 3-year investigation of human rights abuses committed in the name of counterterrorism have revealed some shocking results. My guest today, Mary Robinson, is one of the world's leading figures in international law. Until 2002, she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a post she had to leave behind after sustained pressure from the United States. Mrs. Robinson has also served as Ireland's first female president. As part of a panel of experts set up by the International Commission of Jurists, a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, Mary Robinson and her co-panelists gathered their findings, something she'll share with us on the show as she joins us from London. Well, today we ask, can governments find a way to respect international law and human rights while fighting the so-called war on terror? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE and take part in that chat room. Mary Robinson, great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
In a nutshell, what was the most surprising, perhaps the most disturbing finding of this report?
I think it was the incremental, very worrying trend towards undermining human rights, international human rights and humanitarian law by states in the process, as they would say, of countering acts of terrorism. We had 16 hearings, some of them regional and some of them national in a country. And we looked at the laws and practices in some 40 countries. So we had a lot of material, hundreds of witnesses. We talked to security experts and intelligence officers and police, as well as political figures. And of course, we were greatly supported by Amnesty and the International Commission of Jurists itself, which was commissioned this eminent jurist panel, and many other organizations locally. And those hearings were very compelling. I remember going to a hearing in Washington, D.C., and not very far apart from that, a hearing in Moscow, and just hearing the very different ways in which governments were undermining the rule of law and protection of human rights, but also some trends which were very worrying. The increased use of intelligence, much of it gathered through torture, the disregard for the fundamental prohibition on torture, which until 8 years ago had been always denounced, even though there were countries that did torture. It was very clear that torture was not acceptable, and that got muddied.
Now, the 8-member panel that you're referring to, that you lead, said that 3-year investigation found the damage to human rights law was more severe than you'd all expected. Now, that means that more severe means that you actually went in expecting some fairly significant damage.
We were expecting. In fact, our chair is Arthur Chaskalson, and he was the former Chief Justice of South Africa and former President of the Constitutional Court there. And he was very shocked as a judge coming through the South African system. And Hina Jalani from Pakistan, Bob Goldman from the United States. We were from different parts of the world. We'd all had experience, not just as lawyers and in some cases judges, but also experience of how serious acts of terrorism are. So we were by no means soft or woolly on the importance of combating effectively acts of terrorism, and that every state does have the absolute duty and responsibility to protect people from acts of terrorism. So our report is a balanced report by experienced jurists. But we have to say, and we say it by consensus, we were shocked by the cumulative evidence that we gathered of how much states have undermined the standards of international human rights. And of course, inevitably, people look to the states that have been promoting rhetorically human rights and democracy and freedom, looking particularly to the United States and also the United Kingdom, where we have been talking about this report today.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, of course, it is a number of countries you looked at, but of course, the US being so prominent in the so-called war on terror and being the leading figure obviously gets a lot of the attention. And I wonder, what are the most obvious counter-terrorism measures the US adopted that are, according to that 199-page report, quote, inconsistent with established principles of international human law and human rights law?
I think one of the very important issues that is well discussed in this report is what we call the war paradigm, the so-called war on terror or war on terrorism. And we show that it has been at the root of a lot of the undermining of standards which up to then not only was the United States legally bound by under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but also had been a champion of in the past. And the fact that there would be an ambivalence and worse about torture, the fact that Guantanamo Bay was opened without regard for the Geneva Conventions, and you see now the dilemma of the new administration, thankfully, wanting to close Guantanamo, and the problems that are being faced because people have been held for so long. Some of them have been tortured, the evidence is not reliable, they can't be brought to trial. And a very strong message we have is the need to use the criminal justice system, because acts of terrorism are heinous crimes and people must be brought to justice and they must be put away after being convicted by a court for a very long period. And there needs to be more attention paid to helping police to gather evidence properly, countries to help each other in training, in being able to strengthen independent judges, etc. You know, we need good criminal justice systems. Instead, there has been a whole emphasis on a sort of secret intelligence world, a great expansion of intelligence services with no oversight, no respect for human rights, using exchange of evidence, much of it gathered from countries where it's known that torture was applied, and yet this is not questioned. So there's a complicity in undermining these standards, which is really very worrying.
It's interesting. It sounds like a lack of regulations in the security systems and the checks and balances.
Absolutely.
And justice system, similar to the economic system that seems to be collapsing too. Now, we had a number of emails that came in from around the world, and one came in from Dubai, from Omar al-Sheikh in the United Arab Emirates. And if I can put this to you, he says, I think that governments have no choice but to balance human rights and the war on terror, simply because the war on terror is a war on human rights, brackets as well as other ideals. And so sacrificing these is in itself a submission to the forces of terror. And I wonder, could you see any validity in the argument that there might have to be some sacrifices in rights or in existing regulations in order to ensure security?
It's a good question, and we looked very carefully at the international human rights system. And it has within it the capacity to respond to terrible threats and emergency situations. You can take certain measures as long as you take them carefully, they're transparent, they're time-bound, they're reviewed. You can actually, take certain serious measures if the threat is sufficiently serious. And we are in favour of effective systems. We're in favour of improving intelligence gathering if it is in compliance with human rights, if it is not based on torture. And we have no problem about sharing intelligence on that basis. I would say that our report really does take into account the point in that question that we need to be effective in combating terrorism. People are frightened. But then we looked at situations in the past, including, for example, in Northern Ireland. We had a hearing in Belfast where we were assisted by the Commission for the CAJ, a very good human rights body there. And we talked to senior police people, and they said that the internment in Northern Ireland had been completely ineffective. They used very strong language criticising some of the practices that had taken place, which at the time were justified because of the apparent threat. We looked at countries in Latin America like Argentina in the bad period there, and the same kind of language of justification of special measures because of the seriousness of the threat were being used then. So yes, we accept that the threats are serious, but the most important thing is to uphold the rules, the rule of law, and the values of international human rights, prohibiting torture, prohibiting disappearances, prohibiting rendering people to another country for torture, etc. Because if you undermine those values, then people get very cynical. Why did the world rejoice so much when, on almost his first day in office, President Obama signed executive orders making it explicit that the United States would not torture and that it will be necessary to close Guantanamo Bay? I think that this is, a very important question.
And of course, the Geneva Conventions are always highlighted when it comes to what's being contravened and not. And an email on the subject of treatment of prisoners and potential combatants comes in from Maryland here in the USA. Will Mosley wrote in saying, The US Army's Field Interrogation Manual is written in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Did countries like the US follow those rules to the letter, or did the Bush administration allow for those rules to be ignored?
That was one of the real difficulties. We were adamant that that field manual should apply to all services, including the CIA. And this was resisted by the Bush administration, and it is an issue that I believe the Obama administration will act in a very straightforward way and say it applies right across the board. It's extremely important. It was, when I was a law student, countries had habeas corpus. So the banning of habeas corpus, that people could test why they were being kept in prison or kept in detention. I thought that in countries like the United States would never be undermined, and yet it was. Similarly, this ambivalence about torture and use of the so-called interrogation methods, which actually, under international law, may amount to torture, certainly waterboarding, etc. It's a sad day when this happens, because we know from security experts themselves that evidence obtained under torture may sometimes be accurate, but very often won't be. Right. It'll be that the person tortured saying anything that will stop the torture that they're suffering.
Now, we're going to take a short break, Mrs. Robinson. As we go to break, I want to remind our viewers that they can join in with the chat room by going into livestation.com and entering the chat room there. The debate's taking place as you can see it. But as we go to break, let me just mention the former Vice President Dick Cheney, of course, who was a leading figure in much of this, took what would be considered by many a very hard line on the so-called war on terror. And I want to just play, as we go to break, a little video clip from him where he did an unapologetic interview to the Fox News channel in the last days of his tenure. And we'll get back after the break, but listen to this.
They were not citizens of a state that was a party to the Geneva Convention. They did not adhere to the laws of war. They spent all their time trying to kill civilians for achieve their political ends. They didn't wear uniforms. I mean, by any definition that was available to us at the time, the Geneva Convention does not traditionally apply to terrorists.